All right, welcome, welcome. Thank you for the energizing music, DJ Jen. Okay, let's give the DJ some love. Thank you. You are joining us today for the last conversation series of You Belong Here in Minnesota, our Pride Dialogue series. And today we'll be focusing on why safer trans communities means safer whole communities. And I have my amazing co-host, Kat, and we have our lovely speakers, Philippe, Rebecca, Seal, and I'm Janita Pindara Potter. I am with the Women's Foundation Minnesota, and I'm the Vice President of Strategic Communications and Narrative Change. So first I want to start off with a land and ancestor acknowledgement. As we gather today, please join me in honoring the sacred lands in which we live, learn, and work. The land we call Minnesota includes the ancestral, traditional, and contemporary lands of 11 sovereign nations. We pay homage to those who were here before us on this land, the 7 Anishinaabe nations of the Chippewa and Ojibwe and the 4 Dakota nations. Along with these 11 tribes, we honor all the indigenous peoples of this territory, many from tribes which were never formally recognized by the federal government. Furthermore, by respecting our purpose for being here today, it's important to also acknowledge our Black ancestors who were taken from their homeland and brought here involuntarily to build this nation as we know it. We acknowledge those before us, those among us, and those who are yet to come. And as a foundation, we have a role in acknowledging our history and are responsible for the journey in healing, resourcing, and reparation. So thank you for joining today, everyone. I'm so excited to have our lovely speakers to join us for a robust conversation. I will pass it, well, before I pass it over, sorry, a little bit about the Women's Foundation. So we are the first statewide foundation dedicated to gender justice and racial justice in our core impact areas of economic justice, leadership and community power, holistic well-being, and reproductive justice, as well as safety, which is the main focus of today's conversation. And I will pass it over to Kat, who is the Executive Director of OutFront Minnesota.
Thank you so much, and thank you for hosting the third in the series of conversations, and thanks to my lovely panelists and guests who will be joining us for this last of these conversations. And to all of you who are joining, my name is Kat Roan. I use they or she pronouns. I'm the Executive Director for OutFront Minnesota, which is our state's largest LGBTQ advocacy organization. And I will pass it over to Seal Dwyer to introduce.
Hello, my name is Seal Dwyer. I'm a licensed marriage and family therapist in private practice in St. Cloud, focusing on serving the LGBTQ plus community with trauma. I'm a trauma therapist. I am also on the board of OutFront, and this fall we will be opening a LGBTQ community center in St. Cloud. And I will pass it to Rebecca.
Hello, everyone. My name is Rebecca Lucero. My pronouns are she, her. I am the Commissioner for the Minnesota Department of Human Rights, and I'm so happy to be here with everyone. I'll pass it to Philippe.
Thank you, Commissioner. Hi, everyone. My name is Philippe Cunningham, and I use he, him pronouns. I am based in North Minneapolis. My current position is that I am the United States lead of global leadership programs at the Obama Foundation. But previously, I served on the Minneapolis City Council, where I was the chair of the Public Health and Safety Committee and was a very strong advocate for comprehensive public safety. So very honored to be here and be a part of this conversation. I will pass it back to Kat, I believe.
Thank you all for the introductions. So today's conversation is going to be around safer communities. And I think I'll just start by, kind of kicking it around to the panelists here. When we talk about safety in a cultural context, like that can bring up a lot of different layers of what safety means. But I think oftentimes we look at it through a very narrow lens. And so I'd love to hear from each of our, panelists here today. What does safety mean to you on a personal level, on a social level? What are sort of the pieces of either what safety looks like or how you envision safety? And I'll start, kind of go in reverse order here and go to Philippe.
Yeah, I love this question. So the simplest way for me to be able to capture what safety feels like to me is the ability to be able to be my full authentic self without fear. I want to be able to be my faggoty self walking down the with my hoochie daddy shorts on and have my best life and not feel afraid. To me, that is what safety ultimately is, and for it to be really rooted in community, so that safety is genuine. It's because we are looking out for one another and we're interconnected.
To me now, Kat? Okay, I'll just go. Okay, so, you know, when I was younger, safety used to be like to not be in spaces of harm or hurt. And then as I got older and did a whole lot of work on myself and like was not in those spaces anymore, I think it transitioned to a lot more of what Philippe was talking about. So really safety for me is space to grow, to find new pathways, to breathe, to be with people who help me discover my best self and foster my best self, and to sparkle a lot. And that is what safety means to me now, no longer in my 20s. What a gift.
For me, safety means a place where my body can settle, where it's not on alert, where the bones can settle to the back of my body and I can just be in that space and not be watching my back, not be looking for the danger, but also feeling held, feeling supported in community.
Thank you so much. And as Janita shared, there are so many pieces of data out there, as well as just the personal stories of so many members of our LGBTQ plus communities that point to the fact that many of us aren't feeling safe on many levels. This isn't just about physical safety. This isn't just about, criminal or, violent safety. This is about that holistic picture of what it means to be well, what it means to be able to relax your shoulders, to show up in a space and sparkle, to really bring your full self into all of these spaces. And for so many LGBTQ folks here in Minnesota and around the country, we're not there yet. And I think that's, as we have these conversations about how we do our work, both at OutFront and within all of these different organizations and spaces, what does it mean to get us to those safer communities? And what would it mean and what would it look like for Minnesota to have communities that are safer for people? So OutFront works a lot in the policy realm, but I think one of the things that we often talk about is that policy is only one piece of this bigger puzzle of what it looks like to be safe. So I'll go first to you, Commissioner Lucero, and ask what does it mean to do big policy? What can that do for safety here within Minnesota for folks? What can that accomplish?
It can accomplish a lot. Big policy work is incredibly important. And we talk about all the time that elections have consequences because policy has consequences. It matters, it matters, it matters, it matters, it matters. And oh my gosh, it matters. Also, it's only part of it. If we aren't doing the cultural change piece behind it, it's only going to be a piece of it. I think I come from the civil rights world, and so it's always so important to talk about that policy only happens because of the people behind it. It's the people pushing the work and people on the ground making the change, and then policy comes. And when we talk about civil rights work, you are seeing the policy change happen because of tremendous amount of people who have marched and bled and sometimes given their lives for change to come, for that policy change to come. And so policy is one part of I think that interconnected community that Philippe mentioned there. And so it's part of the work that has to happen for the change. But I think that we see this last legislative session here in Minnesota and the policy changes going on across the country that are doing tremendous harm, that policy matters. And so, yeah.
Yeah, I would agree completely. And I think, when you look at Minnesota, right, we have our Minnesota Human Rights Act, which has protected LGBTQ folks from discrimination at a statewide level for 3 decades at this point, 30 years. That's a huge deal. Minnesota was the first to be inclusive in these spaces. We've done tremendous work. We've made tremendous strides for folks. And yet, somehow 30 years after, passing this inclusive policy, we still have discrimination here in Minnesota. So, as you said, like, policy is deeply important, can do tremendous things for changing people's lives and the way society can operate, but also there's still work to be done. Seal, why don't you share about, like, as we think about sort of what is still left to be done, what communities are still on the margins in your eyes for some of this policy work, and where that culture change is most needed here in Minnesota?
Where the culture change is needed the most is in the rural cities and towns. A lot of beautiful things are happening in the cities, and a lot of things are happening in the outstate. And the outstate is half of the population in Minnesota, and there's a lot of queer folks out here. But we're spread. There may be 1 or 2 in each little small town, whereas in St. Cloud we have quite a huge community, which is amazing. But then finding these communities all over the state, getting them connected, maybe online, hopefully in 3D, finding sources of community for folks when geography is a problem. And then when geography is a problem, there's also the problem frequently of access to resources, because we're dealing with intersectional identities here, and folks in the outstate are not completely, but deal with a lot more of economic disparities, access to medical care, access to all of the different services that it takes to be a healthy human. And as we respond to policy, when we are the folks on the ground, it policy bolsters us up and it supports us and it helps us, but it also then takes action, because policy without action is just words, and it's not happening. And so out here, finding providers, finding community, building resources, building knowledge so that people know that they're not alone, that is where we need to work.
Thank you. Philippe, just building on this conversation, the expansion of policy, the opportunities that policy creates and its limits, how do you feel?
Yeah, I really love this conversation around policy, because policy is really oriented in systems change, and truly we have to have, like, our systems are producing the outcomes that they were intended to produce. And so it's like we have to actually look and examine the systems to be able to see where those opportunities are. One of the most valuable lessons that I learned in leadership around this particular area is that we sometimes have a hard time differentiating between adaptive challenges and technical challenges. Technical challenges are, here is a problem that we can solve with our current knowledge, and there's A plus B equals C. Adaptive challenges are challenges that are constantly shifting, and it requires us to not only think about systems change, but as folks have talked about, is the culture change. It's only going to work if folks embody that change, and are bought in to behaving differently and to showing up differently. And so when we are organizing systems change, we have to step out of this space of, okay, here's a problem that we can solve, A, B, C, and instead think about it more iteratively. Like, so it's a process of building with community. And really, when we do policy, so often it's top down. So it's the policymakers who do it, and then it's implemented on the front line, and it impacts everyday folks. So what does it look like to flip that process, identify really what those adaptive challenges are within safety and how it's changing and molding, and then be able to find the folks who are willing to embody this change and be leaders and in the change effort. So that's one big thing that I think I can speak from my own leadership lessons, is really sometimes we approach these as technical challenges when really we need to be thinking more adaptively.
100%. And I think, you know, so many of the issues that we talk about, whether they're within the LGBTQ community or within other marginalized groups, are always shifting, right? Like our social expectations, our relationships with one another, how we occupy the space are constantly shifting. We can't expect that there's just a simple technical fix to everything. It is a constantly evolving world that we're working through. One of the pieces that I always like to focus on, and, you know, I think, you know, on a very personal level, is how do we keep ourselves safe in this work? As we talk about safety for our communities, each of us has played different roles in the work that we do in caring for and trying to protect and, you know, ensure the safety of communities across Minnesota. What does it mean to keep ourselves safe? I know for me, you know, this is challenging work, right? My identity is bound up in what I'm doing in advancing LGBTQ rights here. And sometimes those conversations, whether it's at the state capitol, whether it's engaging on social media or other spaces, can be deeply challenging on a personal level. You know, when you're, I remember especially coming off of, you know, the Club Q shooting that happened in Colorado. And, you know, we were getting all of these calls from news outlets all over Minnesota asking for our reaction and the feelings on the LGBTQ community after this. And I'm sitting here, you know, on a Sunday morning, like making pancakes for my kids and trying to figure out, like, how do I hold that space for myself of like vulnerability and community representation? And what does it mean to like hold space and care for yourself in the process of trying to keep communities safe? Seal, as our therapist, I'll kick it over to you first, but I think it's really important to talk about personal safety in a broad context in this work.
Absolutely. If I am impaired in any way, then I'm not an effective tool in doing this work. And that is, so I have to take care of myself first, which is very much counter to the central Minnesota logic of giving everything until you collapse and play the martyr. So I have very intentional self-care that I do all the time. I see my own therapist. Every therapist should see a therapist. If your therapist doesn't see a therapist, find a different therapist. So like I see my therapist, I do that work. I do a lot of dance classes and yoga classes and movement because my body has to feel safe and my body has to be grounded and taken care of. And so making sure that I am providing all of the care that I need and modeling at the same time, because, you know, we can always do double duty and model what we're doing at the same time that we're doing it. So yeah.
Philippe?
Yes, this is a hard question because it is something I think I'm still learning. You know, when I ran for re-election in 2012, it was one of the most traumatizing experiences of my life. You know, having been the victim of like a multi-million-dollar misinformation campaign, really had personal consequences for me and my family. And so in full transparency, like I'm still learning how to live with that. And but a big part of it though, is post-traumatic growth. I am a better person than I was when I went into office 5-6 years ago at this point. And you know, the big thing for me was, you know, all this bad stuff happened to me, and I like it was just like to me. And then I actually like flipped the question and was like, okay, so what was by me and what is my responsibility? What are my lessons to learn in this? I pulled that apart and really examined it and took responsibility for where my part was in the work or in the challenges overall, and then made amends to do better. And so, you know, for me, I would say in this particular case, what helped me, you know, keep myself safe was that post-traumatic growth. I didn't stay in that pain, but I will again be transparent in like I'm still figuring out what that means though, you know, like to keep myself safe and have those healthy boundaries of like that doesn't actually stick. So I'm still working on that, but I will say though that the post-traumatic growth really truly changed my life, and I think that I'm a far better person now, having done that work, that self-work. So I'll just throw that out there for consideration as well.
Go for it, Commissioner.
I don't have an answer for this one. I am in the middle of struggling quite a bit. And honestly, you asking this question, it's hard. I don't have an answer. It has been unrelenting and exhausting and traumatic. I go to therapy a lot. I meditate a lot. I go for long walks with my dog a lot. I surround myself with people who love me. This is hard work. My identity is bound up in this work. And there are a lot of people in this space who just don't have any clue how brutal this is. So I don't know how much more I could do this. So I think one smart thing to do is if people in these roles is to know when it's maybe you're done or you need a break, and you can pass it off to the next person. And just know that there's incredible people behind you who are ready and resilient and strong. And that maybe you're ready for the next thing. And that's awesome too. Or you take a break and you regroup. I'm very interested in Googling this post-traumatic growth thing. I've never heard of this before. But I have so much love to give and so much work to do. And I want to be in the right place to do that, wherever that is. And it may not be here, and that's okay. And we should be where we're supposed to be.
Yeah, super appreciate your vulnerability and, all that you're sharing in this and all the work that you've done. I think, one of the things that I always remind my team is the work will always be here. Whether I'm here, whether somebody else is here, the work will always be here. And what we can do is bring our best selves to this current moment and take the time to step back and cultivate those around us to make sure that we have our supports, that we have that community, that there are people who are going to step in when you need to step back, when you need to take a rest, when you need to take that drink of water, because the work will always be here and it's unrelenting, and that can really grind you down. But there's also a beauty in that, right? Of like, we all play a role in this moment of moving something forward to some degree. And if we're all building on that and constantly building on the work that one another is doing, we're building towards a safer, better, beautiful society that I think we all, envision as being the outcome of this, collective effort. I think there's the, sort of, Minnesotans maybe feel it's played out, but that Wellstone quote of "we all do better when we all do better." And I don't think it's played out. It's one of my favorite quotes because I think it really fundamentally underpins the way that I approach this work. And, especially when we're thinking about what it means for communities to be safe. When I think about particularly like trans communities of color within the state of Minnesota, these sort of layers of marginalization that occur here within the state, if I can make Minnesota a safer place for trans communities of color and for trans youth, what does that mean for Minnesotans who aren't trans, who aren't in the LGBTQ community? Would love to hear from you, Philippe, what that looks like for you. Like, why should anybody else care other than members of the LGBTQ community about making a safer Minnesota, for trans folks of color or for trans youth?
Yeah, one of the things that just absolutely blows my mind is transphobic cisgender women, because transphobia is rooted in violent misogyny. And I'm like, how can you not make, it just blows my mind. And so I would say that, like I said, transphobia is rooted in misogyny. Then when you add the layers of anti-Blackness or xenophobia or whatever the case may be on the layers on top of it, then we're looking, then we're looking at a wide array of folks who are positively impacted if we focus on the most marginalized. And so, when I'm thinking about that, it's like, if we focus on bodily autonomy for trans folks, that's also bodily autonomy for reproductive rights. If we are looking at, addressing Black trans youth or, trans youth homelessness, then we're helping all homeless youth by doing that. And so, I think that if folks can get it right, for intersectionally marginalized trans folks, like so trans folks of color, young people, so trans folks with disabilities, if we get that right, it really does have a ripple effect. It's like all the, what do they say, a rising tide lifts all boats. Like that is what equity is in action. And so I would say that's my big shout, like from the rooftops, is we cannot, when we're thinking about policy, when we're thinking about building community, this is what it means to center the most marginalized. So what are the needs specifically of these communities? How do we meet them where they are? And then what does that look like to generalize more broadly to other marginalized group and then the greater population?
Commissioner?
I was taking notes because there were some really good things stated there. When it comes to discrimination across the board, I think it is incredibly important that we just take a step back and look at discrimination law is not built with an intersectional lens. It is built with like, what is your one bucket that you fit in? And it is very much rooted in like, that is how we attack discrimination in the moment. And so the beauty about tackling discrimination or looking at really focusing in on folks that are the most marginalized, trans youth of color, sometimes even focusing on like trans folks in prison is something that we spend a lot of time working on right there. Then you are really looking at where a whole lot of issues come into play, and just has a much larger impact across the board to change systems all over the place in a way that traditional discrimination law doesn't have an impact. And so again, you can kind of get at those culture pieces in a way that policy or law doesn't allow you to in a more natural way.
Seal, do you want to add anything to the conversation?
Yeah, so when we're talking about this, we're also talking, and we have to address finding those resources and getting them dispersed to where they need to be, and making sure that they're appropriate resources. If we definitely need more mental health providers in the state of Minnesota, but we don't particularly need more. I mean, we need more, but we don't need to be sending more white folks out to communities of color. We don't need to be having cisgender straight folks counseling folks who are not. And so there needs to be a bigger focus on within community growth so that we are serving our own communities as well, because finding that match, finding that support as we're doing this, we have to lift up the professionals. We have to lift up the people who can be doing this work and this service, as well as then matching them appropriately with like the trans kids of color.
Absolutely. I think one of the things, that we often hear within LGBTQ rights movements, and we've seen this pop up, especially over the last couple of years, is this sort of false dichotomy of safety of like, if we are creating safe and inclusive spaces for trans folks, particularly for trans women, that we're somehow compromising the safety of other people, namely cisgender women, like that if we have trans women in bathrooms, that cisgender women might be at risk for, men assaulting them. What would you say to those arguments? They come up like time and time again. Like, what does it mean? Why should, cisgender allies care and engage in this conversation around LGBTQ safety? And how do we pick apart those sorts of, false arguments? Philippe, I'll go to you first on this one.
I was hoping you wouldn't, because I need some time to think about it. But because it's a hard question to answer, because I think we're kind of stuck in it right now of like, how do we get this message across that LGBTQ folks are not a threat to straight people and cisgender people? I mean, like, this is literally I mean, Anita Baker, pervert teachers, like, I mean, like, can we seriously like break out of this cycle? Libs of TikTok is just continuing that narrative. And so, you know, I think that we have a challenge of that, because I think that that is just a part of American culture, is that like there is this like ick factor when it comes to LGBTQ folks. And so I will say that I have personally, I mean, this was a while back when I lived in Chicago, was in college, but I was reported to the gym for using the men's locker room because I was, quote, taking advantage of the men. And I was like, I was terrified the whole time I was in there. Like, why, like, how am I causing anybody harm when I'm terrified? And so I think that really, I think it's a narrative change and storytelling. I think that so often we lean into statistics because obviously cisgender women in general, like their greatest threat is men, period. And so like the way that we tell them statistics, we, you know, try to spew these facts, but reality is that we are a storytelling species. That's how our brain works. That's how we learn. It's how we process information. For some reason, us progressives, we're all a bunch of nerds and smart, and we're like, here's all the data. And people are like, I really don't care, because opposition is very good at hitting emotions, right? Safety is one of the most fundamental human needs, right? If we look at the hierarchy of needs. So we have seen repeatedly how threatening people's safety makes them retract and behave in more conservative ways. And so how do we tell the stories about our lived experiences, and also like tell this, like cisgender women should be telling the story too. Like, I am not in fact, I like blah, 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 right? Like, so I would say narrative change, and that is done through storytelling.
Go for it, Commissioner.
When I was a kid, my dad used to talk a lot about how we as humans are crabs in a bucket, and you don't have to put lids on crabs in a bucket because we just pull each other down. My dad used to tell the story about how we're lobsters in a bucket, and it wasn't until I was much older in life and I left New Mexico that I learned it's actually crabs that do that. There's no water and there's no crabs or lobsters in New Mexico. But yeah, crabs are in, and to me, it's like very visually appropriate because you can imagine this like white bucket, and the white bucket to me is like the systems of deep oppression of white supremacy, and like we are all in it, and we're just like literally pulling each other down, and we are crabs in a bucket, and we have no idea that we're in this bucket, that we're being controlled by something much bigger than us, and we're always other.
And she got pulled by the bucket of internet.
I'm sorry, what?
We lost you for a second.
We lost
Sorry.
you. Got you. You're good.
Oh no. So it's exhausting to see how we're constantly creating others over time, and you can see that othering shifting. You can see court cases. You can see us literally putting people in internment camps. You can see us criminalizing different people. You can see us, and it shifts and it cycles and it goes back, and it's always the same narrative of this other. And Anita Baker is certainly there, but it's also not new. It's also, you know, it's Japanese internment, and it's also then Muslims, and it's also now very much female trans athletes, but it's the same dang story. It is exhausting. And I think when I take a step back and recognize that it's actually part of this much, much, much larger crab/lobsters in a bucket narrative, then it helps me be less exhausted by the whole thing, because then we don't have to play lobsters we don't have to play whack-a-mole with like, what's the story of the other that's being told right now, and that this is just all part of a big plan to keep us with a scarcity mindset of jealousy and stress and competition, and to tear each other apart instead of bring us together and recognize how much we have to actually be there for each other and see each other as these incredible, complex, beautiful, loving beings. And so I don't know, the othering mentality is just something that is like built deeply into capitalism, and like we have to recognize that that's what it is, and stop engaging in that, like stop being lobsters or crabs or whatever we want to be.
It's time to start pulling those buckets down and tipping them over.
Tipping them over.
Let those crabs run free. Seal, I'll kick it over to you.
Yeah, so the human brain is oriented so deeply towards survival and so deeply towards danger, and we react in 0.4 of a millisecond to anything that our amygdala determines as danger. And so our bodies react to the things that we are told is dangerous so much faster than we are able to consciously think or even emote and feel. And in our culture right now, the conservative line that queer people are dangerous, that we're pedophiles, that all of those things is utilizing that fear and that danger as a weapon in an exquisite way. Like they are driving us to the very smallest, most marginalized parts and holding them up as an example of how horrible it could be. And it's creating this conversation that even the most basic analysis can blow out of the water. That whole conversation last school year about litter boxes in the schools, like we could blow that up so many different ways with a teeny tiny bit of logic, but everybody was operating on fear, and there's no space for logic when we're running on fear. Literally, the logic parts of our brain are shut down when our bodies are running on fear.
Thank you. So I think we'll close with just one final question before we do just open for questions from those of you who are in the room. Feel free to drop any questions you might have into the chat. Obviously, there's a lot to tackle when it comes to community safety, both for the LGBTQ community, but for our communities at large. And a lot of these are really big, messy, systemic problems that are going to take a long time to really dismantle and get to the place where we're really safe. But just thinking back in sort of a brief moment over this last year, when's a moment for each of the panelists that you witnessed safety, whether it was for you, for members of the community, for those you're serving? And I'll go back to an example that I had. I was chatting back and forth with a family down in Iowa earlier this year after Iowa had banned gender affirming care for youth. And we had this back and forth. I was able to connect them in with a, trans affirming, gender affirming care provider here within the state of Minnesota. They're still living in the state of Iowa, but able to drive up here to the Twin Cities to get access to care. And I remember, we had this long back and forth, talked for about an hour. And at the end, and I've, shared this quote a number of times, but I think it just really hit home for me, the importance of the work we're doing here. And they said, tonight, I'm going to sleep more hopeful. And, that sense of safety, even if they weren't in a safe space, like Iowa is still a really complicated, contested state on these issues. Their kid still has so much that they're going to have to navigate through. But to have that place of safety in that moment, to have that reassurance and that hope and that security was deeply important to them. So Seal, I'll kick it to you first, and then we'll go to the commissioner and wrap up with Philippe. But what is one moment of safety, even if it's brief and fleeting, that you've experienced this last year personally?
So in St. Cloud, we've created a very intentional community of entirely queer folks, mostly neurodivergent queer folks, and watching a new person walk into our community and look around and there's flags on our walls and everybody's just chilling out on the floor and singing and being silly and being together. And during our class, everybody sings along to Rainbow Connection. Like, it's absolute silliness, and there's not a lot of space for fear in silly. And so when we're all goofing off and we're singing together, and it's the most affirming experience.
Kat, thank you so much for this question. I love, Seal, your answer there. It like was healing just to hear that. Hold on real quick. Taco, go to bed. My dog gives me life. I'm gonna just talk about the moment when conversion therapy was banned. Very good protector. This past year, it was something that had been worked on for a policy that had been worked on for a very long time. And many of you know this, but I was sent to conversion therapy when I was in high school, and my parents didn't know any better, right? Their religion told them, therapists told them, like so many people told them. I have no anger towards my parents about this. And I have just so much joy that this is just done, and all the safety, like what that means, that it will literally save people's lives. It was incredibly healing for me personally that happened. And I really loved that experience and that moment of sheer joy. And so also just much gratitude to everyone who worked for that for years. So.
Yeah, so definitely I would say like a highlight for me was when we had the Minneapolis Public Schools Gender Resource Fair. So that was, that got shared on Libs of TikTok. And so then it was originally going to happen in North Minneapolis at an elementary school in my community. But then they started getting threats. They started getting bomb threats. The principal started like getting personal threats. So they moved it to the Davis Center. But as soon as I found out that was happening, I was like, we are going to surround those families and those little nuggets with lots of love. And so I hosted a community dance party that took place outside of the Davis Center. And as the families were arriving, we were all dancing and had Lady Gaga and had flags and we're waving at the kids. And it was just so exciting and just really heartwarming that so many people came out. Like I was just like, hey, we're gonna have a dance party. If y'all wanna come. And a whole bunch of people came because they were so committed to like that not being our culture here. Like, oh, we're not gonna have the Proud Boys coming into Minneapolis. You know, we're not going to have, you know, Nazis, like no way, not on our watch. And so we had a really fun time, and I got some feedback from one of the parents who said that, you know, they were so terrified of going to the event because of the fact that it had been shared on a hate site. And when they were coming, they're like, oh, there are people standing outside, I don't know. And then she said when she saw the flags and that we had our outfits and music, that she just burst out crying. Like it just meant so much to her to be a part of a community that would protect her and her children in that way. And so I would say, you know, it's, you know, we had folks who showed up, you know, anti-trans folks who showed up. But we had a very clear line in the sand. We're like, we're not engaging with them at all. We are focused on the kids and the family. And like those folks had no energy to work with. So they just left. Like it worked. And so we just had a grand old time. And so I would say that really affirmed, like we didn't involve the police department at all. We really oriented it based in community. And so I felt really proud of what we were able to create for that and really draw a line that we will not tolerate that here.
It's a wild, beautiful future that is rooted, honestly, in our community care and history. And I think, you know, when we talk about safety and care and what we're envisioning, there's a world in which our policy and our communities come closer and closer together, where that joy informs the ways in which we make policy choices and changes in our systems, and where we can build a future where we're celebrating each other and living in that moment of silliness and happiness and community, and caring for one another in a way that I think feeds our soul. So thank you all for sharing those. I'm going to open it up to the room if folks have questions for myself or any of the panelists about what community care or safety can look like for LGBTQ communities and more.
Thank you for that, Kat. One of the questions that some folks had surfaced is, as we think about safety, and I really appreciate the conversation around psychological safety as well. And, maybe this is a question for our therapist or whatnot, but when it feels like things are so heavy, and it feels like we're still also grieving and we're still trying to heal from all these years, right, of being the epicenter of so many things. What are some easy, or I shouldn't say easy, but what are some ways that we that folks could really help think about what will sustain themselves, their bodies, the movement? What are some ways in which that's possible?
So when we're talking about this kind of grief, like grief is one of those immovable forces. We have to feel it. We don't want to. Everybody fights it. Absolutely. Everybody fights feeling grief, but we have to. It's much more powerful than most other emotional experiences because it's so all-encompassing. But we almost need to treat it in the way that we treat burnout. Because burnout is expending more resources than we're getting fed over and over and over a long period of time. And burnout does not heal quickly. It takes as long to heal burnout as it took for the burnout to happen. And so as we're doing this work, becoming very sensitive to what feeds us, to what experiences we leave feeling lighter, feeling joy, feeling happiness, also paying attention to what experiences we leave feeling heavy, and trying to either shift those heavy experiences maybe to somebody who won't feel so heavy coming out of them, or shift or release some of those, because we have to protect ourselves. And so finding that balance of more things that feed us than that are taking from us.
If I may add, one of the things that I think we so overlook is our physical health. And so just meeting our basic physical needs, like drink enough water, make sure you're eating, particularly, when we're holding such heaviness, what you're eating, if you have the ability to try to make it as whole as possible, right? Trying to not get too many processed foods, getting enough sleep, it's so hard to keep a clear head and stay anchored when you are super tired or you're hangry or you're dehydrated. And so I'll just throw out there that's a really big paradigm shift for me, is recognizing how much I had to move away from the idea of resilience, essentially meaning being able to increase my tolerance for injustice. And resilience really instead shifting towards restoration, and what does that look like, and what does that mean for me and my healing process. So just wanted to share that as well.
And I'll build one thing off of that, which is there's a lot of really beautiful quotes about rest but I don't see clearly when I'm in the middle of it, which is to say that I look at my calendar and this is all incredibly important, and what am I not supposed to do? And so it is very helpful for me to have somebody else come in who can see clearly, because I'm so stressed that I don't see clearly, and say like, actually, this check-in, it can be 10 minutes. It does not need to be 30 minutes. And actually, you don't even need to do this check-in, but like literally somebody who can transactionally just cancel stuff for me so that I have the space to eat and meditate and rest. And like, I get it, rest is restorative, blah, 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 but look at my calendar. When am I supposed to do it? And so like somebody else who can see clearly must cancel things off my calendar because I cannot do it because it all feels so important. And I know it isn't as important as it feels. And the second it all gets canceled, I have the time. And in fact, I'm better at all of it. So.
Excellent. Thank you all. There was a question up the chat a little ways from Cam, just asking about ways that we can help to make families fleeing from other states to Minnesota and trans folks fleeing from other states feel safe once they're here. And I'll just, give a couple of quick answers from an OutFront perspective. One, I think it's just recognizing that we have more work to do here in Minnesota to make our own communities feel safer, and that work will help make other folks feel safer. So if you're already doing work to make Minnesota communities safer, then you are doing good things for the folks who are coming here. I think too, and this is a challenging one for Minnesotans, is like extending that generous welcome, that sort of cold Minnesota nice exterior that's hard for people from other places to break into. Doesn't do us any favors when we're trying to welcome folks from other states, especially folks who have gone through traumatic experiences and are really trying to grapple with what it means to have their lives upended and uprooted. And so extending that generous welcome and really inviting people into circles and spaces where they can start to find new connections and friendships is deeply important. And then I think, finally, it's really thinking about like, we have a depth of history here in Minnesota of welcoming and supporting different communities in different ways. And so not seeing this as some sort of like isolated brand new thing, but like, how does this look in the context of other work that's been done, whether it's around abortion access, whether it's around welcoming different immigrant communities, and where can we learn from both the folks who have deep cultural and personal histories around this work and rely on their expertise, and also where can we learn from the pitfalls of where we haven't been as welcoming or supportive. It's a new challenge, it's a new group of people, it's rapidly evolving, but we have history and we have the ability to do this in a way that's supportive.
I really appreciate the generous welcomes. I will say that like if there was a program that was like adopt a new family that's moved to Minnesota, like absolutely my family would say come over for dinner, and so that folks aren't feeling like we just uprooted our whole life and now we're completely by ourselves. So like I love that generous welcome. One of the things I think too that I have in my mind is the reality is that we have politicians that have created refugees within the United States. And so thinking essentially like a similar approach with like resettlement and bringing folks in, and like what are the types of support that folks specifically need, and folks are coming traumatized, right? And so I put that out there of like there are models that are similar, we just haven't applied it in this particular way. But we are in a time in which American politicians are creating refugees of folks who live within the country, and so I think that we have some models to be able to work from as well.
Any other questions for this group? Well, I will kind of wrap things up a little bit. So this is the third conversation that we held. We started with a conversation around Minnesota's trans refuge laws. We had a second conversation around the intersection of LGBTQ rights and reproductive rights. And here we're coming together around the idea of community safety. And I think one of the things that's just a through line for me in all of this, one is the beauty and the depth of the folks showing up for this work. We've brought in folks who come from, government lenses, from, personal practice, from community foundations, from, just their own personal lived experience around these things. And, I am reminded day in and day out, and again, this is that sort of like the work will always be here, that there are also so many layers to the people working on these problems. These aren't problems that are going to be solved just through governance or just through nonprofit worlds or just through if we just gave a little bit more money or showed up to one event. But all of those things are building towards a future in which we're more safe, we're more wholly recognized, we're able to fully express ourselves in different ways in, beautiful and important spaces. And so, I'm reminded throughout all of these conversations of the layers of the work being done and the history of the work being done. Minnesota has had a long and deep history of LGBTQ engagement running back more than 50 years in a modern sense. And, that work just continues to build today. And I think, the other piece that I'm reminded of, especially through today's conversation, is that through line of community. And, the folks here in this room, you're seeing bits of what that community can look like for folks, of what it looks like to take care of one another, what it looks like to build community spaces that care for people as their full selves. And I want to believe that there's a Minnesota that values that sense of community and care. And I think we all can play a role in building a Minnesota that lives up to that value in a more holistic way. So thank you all. And, I think, as I sort of like reflect on the conversation series and, all the different voices that are here, I think one of the things that gives me hope is the way that which our diverse communities are showing up for one another in a new and different way and being afforded access to these spaces and these systems in a way that we historically haven't been. And, this is just the first step towards a world that 50 years from now, people are going to be having very different conversations about. And I'm left every day in this work, and especially when I think about the great people that I'm doing this work with, and many of whom are here as panelists today, like a deep sense of hope and fulfillment and beauty in what can be accomplished. It's not going to happen tomorrow, but it will happen. And that sense of we all do better when we all do better, when we're taking care of one another, when we're building these systems, when we're building these spaces for that joy, whether it's little small pieces of joy sitting around that circle singing Rainbow Connection, whether it's bringing refuge to a family, whether it's working through somebody's case, the Minnesota Department of Human Rights, whether it's trying to build new systems of community safety, like all of these are fragments of a beautiful piece. And sometimes we're so stuck in our own work that we don't get to see that whole. And I'm deeply blessed and deeply grateful to be able to see that whole so many times through these conversations.
That is so beautiful, Kat. Thank you so much for that. And I can't thank you enough for hosting and facilitating and leading the conversation. And thank you to our speakers. For those of us who weren't able to be at the prior conversations, well, we have it on our YouTube channel. And we also, which is in the chat there, and we'll also be doing follow-up reflections in partnership with OutFront, of course, to kind of share a little bit more about the beautiful insights that folks have shared and all the really great resources as well. And now I'll kind of go to our how to get involved. What sort of resources do we have, right? So we've said this before, follow the leadership of our LGBTQ plus movement leaders like Kat and OutFront and everybody in this conversation. Support the work of those groups and organizations, right? Be in community, have conversations, right? Be silly, read books, share music and movement, and of course, give to sustain the movement. Building the work takes time, and of course, growing your understanding. And I love, of course, Philippe sharing about stories and what is the stories we need to tell that we know to be true, that we've always known, even those stories that didn't rely on systems that didn't include us to begin with, right? So I think that's so critical to share. And of course, building a democratic culture in which your sphere of influence, including spanning more approaches to public safety, is critical. So thank you so much for this wholesome conversation. And then in the next slide, we have some resources again that we want to share, that we'll also continue to share. And if you want to get in touch with Kat or I or any of the other speakers around our work, feel free to connect with us here, shoot us an email. We, part of, I think, this culture of collective care is also figuring out what is welcoming, how do we be more inclusive? And I think it's so important to be able to, be in community in so many different ways. And so with that, thank you so much for everybody in all these, conversations we've been having together. And hopefully we'll see you at the next conversation series that we host through the Women's Foundation and our amazing grantee partners, just like Kat and the OutFront team. So if we can get some, unmute, some shouting, some hand clapping, some whatever, snapping. All right, yes, this is how we wrap up Pride. I hope you all enjoy the sun, and thank you so much again for everyone's time. Take care.
Thank you all.
And
Thanks,
if you're
everyone.
at Beyonce, Kat has some details. Let's go.
Yeah, so if you want some Beyonce tickets, keep an eye on OutFront Minnesota's social media and email channels. We are going to be giving away some tickets shortly, so keep an eye out.
And with that, I'll say get into formation. I know, you're cheesy. Sorry. Bye, everybody. Thank you so much.